morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar. I'm Tony Schönenberger, I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is a global platform for dialogue to discuss developments which will impact our society, but particularly our businesses in the next couple of years. I'm pleased to inform you that the STARS China Symposium in Shenzhen in October 23 was very successful. The 100 participants got deep insights into the latest political and economic developments in China, including visits to Tencent, Ping An, and the Shenzhen Stock Exchange. Today, we are deepening our understanding of developments in China. And I have the great pleasure to welcome Jörg Wuttke. Jörg, you obviously need no introduction. Everybody knows you. He is the President Emeritus of the European Union Chamber of Commerce. He has been in China for more than 30 years, and he is really one of the leading experts on China. And what I really like about Jörg is he is pretty much outspoken. And last but not least, I should also mention that Jörg Wuttke is a member of the STARS International Board. I'd like to introduce you now to our moderator, Markus Herrmann. Markus is the Managing Director and founder of China Macro Group, CMG. CMG also curated the program of the STARS Shenzhen Symposium last month. Markus is also a member of the STARS Foundation Board. So Markus, thank you very much again for moderating. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tony. Good morning in Switzerland and Europe. Good afternoon in China and Asia. I would like to welcome you also from my side to this webinar with Jörg Wuttke, whom I'll briefly introduce, adding some few points in a moment. We chose the title today for the webinar, 12 months into China post-COVID. China's economy, policy, and evolving postures in international affairs. What does it mean for European business? Today's webinar is part of the Staying in Dialogue with China series. It's actually the 8th webinar that we're holding in 2023. We started with Jörg, we end with Jörg. In between, we had Bai Chongen, Xing Yujing, Jorge Toledo, Jia Qingguo, Fu Cong, and Jörg Uri. And now back to Jörg Wuttke. In terms of logistics, we plan for 45 to potentially 60 or 55 minutes from now. And I will ask questions to Jörg along 3 categories: economy, then policy, and in the end, international affairs. All participants are very welcome to put questions into the Q&A box, and I will weave them in the 3 sections when our conversation, as our conversation will flow. Briefly adding a few points on Jörg. Jörg is born in the Kraichgau. It's a hilly region in Baden-Württemberg. I'm mentioning that because it's also close to the Swiss border. And then he set out to start a unique career in China with ABB and BASF. And he has been the 3-term, as Tony was mentioning, president of the EUCCC, now president emeritus. And to sum it up, Jörg has a unique, globally unique vantage point on China and unique experience that we don't want to tap in now. So thank you very much for being with us, Jörg. I will directly kick off with the first question and hand over to you. On China's economy, everyone is watching China's economy. The IMF has revised some of the figures. There's discussions about the 4th quarter, what will happen there. How would you characterize the current state of China's economy?
Well, thank you, Tony, for inviting me, and thank you, Marcus, for being such a good pal and squeezing answers out of me. It's wonderful to bookend this wonderful program with great speakers. Well, it was a peculiar year. We started with despair. We had COVID all over the place, December, January. And then there was this sign of relief, this feeling as we can go back to normal with great expectations. Business sort of came back February, March. And then we ended up basically this year with a lot of uncertainty, unfulfilled business dreams and wishes. And again, the duration of decision-making in the Chinese government, which now has been basically aligned with everybody that Xi Jinping wanted, has been surprisingly slow, very slow. We are now in a situation where we have a serious real estate crisis. And real estate, again, including construction, is 25% of GDP. We have a damper in the sentiment of people. After all, real estate is 66% of the people's Chinese households' wealth. And of course, that puts a damper on the local finances. In many of these cities, land sales was 40% of income, and now that has been diminished. And of course, the stress is tremendous on these 4,000 commercial banks that are standing for 50% of the assets. Well, is that going to mean that China is going to collapse? Certainly not. The resources are very strong. We have 5 extremely solid banks for the other 50%. China is in a beautiful position to own everything. They have 100 big SOEs, 150,000 small SOEs. So, you know, the thing is now actually all about sentiment, and that's really not good. Sentiment dampens the consumption pattern. And we are plagued again and again by overcapacity. The Chamber did a report in 2009 and 2016, and now we are back again to this. So China, in a way, has to rely on exports. That's the safety valve for overcapacity in China. And I'm sure, Marcus, at the end, when we talk about Europe-China relationships, that's where we end up.
Yeah, thank you, Jörg. When you talk about sentiment, you put such a flashlight on it. Do you see a difference, or can you maybe talk about the consumer sentiment as opposed to the private sector investment sentiment, Chinese private sector?
Well, the consumer sentiment is very diverse. We have actually quite good domestic travel. We have restaurants full. We have catering. We have all of that. But at the same time, when you look at the PMI as it came out yesterday, the NBS was quite negative. Today's Standard & Poor's PMI was actually surprisingly much better. They have different constituencies. The NBS covers the whole of China, more SOEs, whereas Standard & Poor's, the former Caixin PMI, covers more coastal areas and private entrepreneurs. So in a way, it was very telling to see that the sentiment among private entrepreneurs actually is increasing. It's improving, which is very encouraging. But it does not translate into something which is very, very important. If you see 50 as basically the threshold of expansion or contraction, employment data was at 46. So it's really serious that companies are holding off employment or even shedding employees. Of course, that dampens the whole atmosphere over there. So we have a very diverse development in the economy over here. Not everything is bad, but certainly those in overcapacity plagued industries, also in batteries, wind turbines, and solar, for example, technologies that where China had nothing 20 years ago, is very rampant. So it's a continent with extremely different economic performances, also in real estate sector. We have first-tier cities, with the exception of Tianjin, actually doing quite well. And then third to fourth-tier cities, they seriously tank. I mean, minus 25% year on year. And on top of it, Marcus, the problem we have right now is that the data set is always referring to last year. And last year, again, November, December was a very low base. So in a way, we have to be very cautious when we look at year-on-year development, because the data set might be looking much better than actually the underlying business activities.
Yeah. Thank you, Jörg, for reminding us on this year-on-year logic that we're actually dealing with all the time when we talk about numbers. Still going back, because you mentioned that the leadership is surprisingly slow in policymaking. So there may be a link to the sentiment. Maybe you can talk about that link. And when you also alluded to the leadership actually put everyone in place that the leadership wanted to be there. So why is the policymaking slow? And is the slowness also a factor that affects the sentiment?
Well, as usual in Beijing, you never know anything. It's just guessing. It's sort of trying to be picking up information pieces and putting them together in a plausible manner. Again, I mean, they have lined up everyone. They have a prime minister that has a much lesser important role than his predecessors. We have a very strong vice premier, He Lifeng, an old buddy of President Xi. So we have those people in place. But again, it appears to me that maybe they misjudged the recovery story. They were too optimistic, or that they were not sure that because of the kind of alignment these former chief of staffs have to Xi Jinping, that maybe they wait for him to give them the order of what to do and what not to do. This old problem of chiefs of staff with their bosses. Maybe also we have a lack of policy debate that would rise the urgency of decision making. It's possibly more of an echo chamber right now. And all of this together possibly gives a a much slower response rate than we would have expected in normal circumstances, or in particular when everybody's aligned with the big boss. So in a way, you also have to keep in mind is that they have their plate full. It has not been a good year for the president. US-China relationship was strained. You had all kinds of challenges in other areas. So in a way, it's tough. And again, if one man decides everything, you know, even she has only 24 hours and 7 days a week.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you talk about misjudging, basically the economic recovery after COVID, when you think back to the 14th Five-Year Plan and the 20th Party Congress, all basically policy directions that were taken, have you seen in this year that we have now been in 1 year post-China COVID, any change to any of these fundamental principles? Or do you think the misjudged economic recovery is actually the only factor that is not going according to plan?
I think we still stick to most of 14th Five-Year Plan. I mean, again, this is a planning-oriented economy. We still have a very strong focus on state-owned enterprises, more than ever, particularly in the real estate sector, where the private developers go belly up and the SOEs are holding the fort, so to speak. We see still a very strong emphasis on ecological development. That is really on the upside. As I look outside my window here in Beijing, it's a blue sky and has been for days already. And in a way, so it has not changed much. The problem is that it has not changed much. You know, I mean, when you do a 14th Five-Year Plan, is that you anticipate something and then the world is totally different. You know, as Harold Macmillan, the former Prime Minister of the UK, said, events, boys, events. You know, we had COVID, we had the US sanctions on the Chinese economy. We have now a discussion in Europe about increasing protectionism. So in a way, they should move, and they should move faster in order to open up. They haven't dealt with the Foucault system. They haven't really done any of these reforms. They're still to a large extent in Sunday speech mode. And time is pressing. It is very telling that we had no third plenum this year. There will be no third plenum, I guess, focusing normally on the economy, because the third plenum requires massive data research, massive policy debate months before it is launched in order to then see how things shape up. Now, next week, I think, the week after, we have the financial conference. And then possibly we get a bit more of ideas about where this economy is going. But again, time is pressing, and the more the kind of waiting continues, the more people are actually going to be reluctant to put money into assets and invest, because for investment you need optimism, you need data sets that are good, and that also has been challenged recently.
Yeah, thank you, Jörg. I'm getting questions on the international affairs side, so I will weave them in once we go to international affairs. So thank you for raising these questions. On the third plenum, Jörg, I will also come back because I have one more question there. Just briefly to close on, because you also talked about real estate, and you mentioned that there's a variety of performances, but maybe just a high-level question, because on the supply side, basically intervention from the Chinese government, there's very little that we have seen so far. It was very targeted measures. Is there anything in the making, or what do you anticipate?
Well, I have great sympathy on targeted measurements if your wallet is smaller than it used to be. You know, China was in an enviable situation with strong growth and strong outlook of growth, just to pour money, like, you know, in 2008, 2009, into the marketplace. Now, after they haven't spent $230 billion on quarantine measures and vaccination and testing, there's not much money left, you know. And so in a way, they have to use it targeted, and they do. To their credit, they do. For example, you have Evergrande. Evergrande has debt in a magnitude of 300 billion US dollars. Monday is going to be interesting if Hong Kong decides to let them go belly up or not, because they're listed in Hong Kong. So they have 300 billion as debt. There's no way in hell they're ever going to recover. But how are they going to basically deflate? And they still have to work on 600,000 unfinished apartments. And so that is actually where people prepaid, and the company has to finalize it. And that's where the problem starts. And that's where the money comes in. We have seen an increase in construction activity, in particular in these apartments where it was semi-finished. And the developers across China altogether, estimation by GAFCAL is that they need $1 trillion US, I think 7.5 trillion renminbi, in order to finish these millions of apartments which are not finished yet. So the upside is that there is something going on, and that will ripple on, have a ripple-on effect downstream into more furnitures, into more electronic goods, white goods, and everything that you need for apartment, because that has been really lagging. And that has a positive impact, of course, on the chemical industry where I work in order to actually sell. So in a way, 2024 might see an upside of a ripple-on effect from these semi-finished apartments. But then the danger is we fall off the cliff in 2025, because land use, land sales and apartment sales is diminishing. I think when it comes to the sales of apartment, we are at the level of 2013, and when it comes to the sale of land space in order to actually build and eventually something, we are down to 2009. A steep decline in these areas. So we have an upside, small one, but it's buying time, so to speak. And after that, China's aging, China's population is shrinking. We have half of the babies that we had 10 years ago. There is not this kind of demand for space anymore that it used to be.
Like some of the fundamental growth drivers, urbanization, population growth, fundamental GDP growth, they've all shifted. And it's good that you mentioned the fiscal limitation, of course, that China also has. I have two more questions in this bucket on the economy. Basically, the question of when do Chinese companies actually go out, because we talked about the sentiment of the Chinese private sector. So I would like to ask you, do you see any pattern or any re-injected energy or just no energy at all now of Chinese companies to go out, and where do they go?
They never go out. If they have any smell or whiff of state-owned enterprises, they hang in there. Again, the overcapacity studies of the chamber have clearly indicated that this is the problem that China creates. China has 60% of global manufacturing capacity. They're standing for 31% of global production, and they only stand for 14% of global consumption. So you can just see how much of these capacities underutilized in business terms, as you have maybe studied Betriebswirtschaft, economics also, utilization of 50 or 40% is killing money. And you see it in the car industry. They could produce 41 million cars. If you add a night shift and a weekend, it could be 50, and they're selling in China 23 this year. That leaves 27 million unsold. Well, you can sell it still. 3 million, I guess, this year will be exported. But the difference between 23 and 50, which is the ultimate capacity in car producing, is 27, which is one time US 14 and one time Europe 13. So, I mean, hypothetical, China could actually replace the entire car industry in US and Europe overnight. Of course, that's not possible. So in a way, that shows that you have some tremendous good companies and winners. BYD is printing money, and NIO in the second quarter, if you look in the published data set, is losing $35,000 for every car they're selling, $35,000 every car. So in a way, is NIO going to go out of the marketplace? We don't know. But there's a lot of sympathy in Beijing to say, we have 140 car companies, 40 of a certain size, which matters. But maybe we want to have single digit, to have those companies with a solid sales, with solid money earning that actually goes into R&D. We don't want this cutthroat competition, which is normally in China. So who is going belly up? Not really the Chinese, but I can tell you who's leaving the marketplace. It's the foreigners, It's Ford, it's Mitsubishi, it's Stellantis, and all of the above. And for the rest, it's fight or flight. Shall I hang in there because I'm a global player and have to be in this technology fitness center, China, in particular on EV? Or do I say, forget about it. This is absolutely not sustainable. I'm leaving. The Germans decided to stay and hang on. And so did the Americans, in particular GM and Tesla, of course.
Just to make sure that I got you right, because you basically said as soon as there's an element of SOE, Chinese companies actually don't go out. And then you actually said that if you look at the total manufacturing capacity of China, I think you mentioned the number of 60% that is globally concentrated in China. And basically compared against that, we actually see very little going out of Chinese companies, given their potential. Is that the right understanding? Or?
Yeah, I mean, 60% means they have tremendous assets idle. underutilized assets, meaning that too much steel, too much aluminum, too much everything, basically, not just cars. And 31% of global production is already way too much. If you benchmark it with this 14% of global consumption, you know, there has to be a bit of a calibration going on. But again, this country is geared towards overcapacity because, again, nobody leaves the marketplace. Every little province and city keeps the local champion in cement or in whatever product going. Of course, there are always bankruptcies in China. It's not that everybody is sort of hanging on, because you have a lot of private companies that basically now are folding up. But again, 150,000 SOEs is a lot of companies with too much capacity. And again, it's Beijing is surprisingly weak in actually intervening and making that a decent bankruptcy process where people don't have to worry about their livelihood. So in a way, everybody's subsidizing their local champions and ruining their local finances in this as a consequence.
Picking you up on when you talked about foreign business, let's maybe talk about European business. There's a lot of, let's say, discussion that European business now has to do more localization. They maybe consider more M&A. Some of them even consider local listing. They think about entering JVs, strategic partnerships, and so on. Some of that probably driven out of risk consideration, but most fundamentally probably to be effective in the environment. Out of these trends that are being perceived or observed, are they happening on the ground? And is it for what kind of motives are they happening?
Well, as you can see, last time foreign money is leaving China. It's primarily, of course, the funds, the fund managers. I think 75% of all the funds invested in the first quarter this year has left in the meantime. As Wall Street puts it, China's non-investable, you know. When it comes to this incredible decrease of FDI minus, as a matter of fact, it's very interesting to see that companies that normally keep their retained earnings in China actually are transmitting them abroad because they don't see any profitable business. Again, China might produce cars, but they don't produce money, no profits. And so people are transferring the money out and put it elsewhere. Again, the interest differential between the US and China is quite big, 2 to comparison to 5 roundabout. And so in a way, it's very hard to find niches in China actually where you make money. And so money companies are leaving. It's interesting to see that primarily Chinese companies are leaving, in particular into the ASEAN region. We see an incredible inflow of Chinese investment in Malaysia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, and other places. And like a flying geese pattern, basically European developers and European suppliers are following them. If you ask the European Chamber in Hanoi in Vietnam, they see quite an influx of European companies. It's not because they think China's non-investable. They see the Chinese companies are moving out. Now, the question is, why are they moving out? Well, first, they want to be in the benefit of, for example, a Vietnam-Europe free trade agreement. Second, if they produce in Malaysia or Cambodia and other places, they have no issue when you have an export going to the United States. And data set says so. You know, the Chinese exports to the US went down by 14%. And all of a sudden, ASEAN is the biggest trading partner. Well, ASEAN certainly is not a demand story. It is a transport hub in a way that adds value, which is good for ASEAN. And then you ship it as made by these countries into the US and into the European Union. So in a way, it's very interesting to see that this is partly for political reasons, but also certainly cost. If you look into shoe and textile going into Bangladesh and so forth, even India is considered to be interesting for Chinese companies. So in a way, there is a pattern developing, and that pattern is gonna hold. Are European companies not really keen on China? Well, there are not many European companies active here in the first place, frankly speaking. You know, on average, we have, and according to Rhodium, $7 to $8 billion every year of investment, whereas 33% is done by 4 German companies: Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW, and BASF. So that's not very normal. You know, last year was even more pronounced. I think it was $9 billion investment, best year ever, but 85% from 4 German companies, because BMW bought out their partner in Shenyang, which was a cool $4.2 billion. So in a way, where are the SMEs? Where are the other companies? So we will continue to invest, particularly in machinery, in cars, in chemicals, because there is no second China, frankly speaking. But again, in comparison to the size of the economy, market access issues, a questionable profit outlook actually makes us underinvested in China. If you just benchmark it with the US, we as European Union 27 invest into the US every year $160 billion. You heard me right, $160 billion, and China $8 billion. Now again, that's not really fair comparison, because it's pears and apples, because in the US we can do M&As, in China we hardly can do this. But as the BMW example last year of 4.2 buying out 25% of Brilliance has indicated, well, I mean, if you open up your market and let us do it, then the money flows in.
You also allude to, thank you very much, Jörg. You also allude to the saying that I've also heard recently, that the next China is China. I know you have a data point regarding India. Maybe we can get back to that. I would like to weave in a question. You talked about the hukou system earlier. And the question I have is, migrant workers have been the engine of China's spectacular economic growth over the last 3 decades, but they basically are still subject to legal restrictions. How do you see reform dynamics regarding the hukou system?
I think that's going to be really tough. I think the essence of that is that there has been a informal, invisible deal between the government and the urban populations of the big cities. It's like, you know, we get these guys in there, but they will not populate your schools, your hospitals, and all the other facilities. They will basically not cause competition to your services that you get as a Beijing or Shanghai, for example. So we had millions, 100 million or more people that actually were second-best citizens, second-class citizens. And again, how to actually now, when the urban middle class is stressed out, their real estate sector is declining, their kids are not really getting the jobs that everybody hoped for, they can see there's a lot of uncertainty. Now to tell them, by the way, we make a hukou reform, and then you can line up with 50 immigrants or hukou workers in the hospital, or you have 30 more kids in the school, that might be politically really challenging. So I don't see that actually happening. It would be beneficial to have a more transparent market in labor, more flexibility and so forth. But China is not good at making decisions which might cause volatility.
Yeah, thank you very much for bringing actually the local political considerations in explaining why hukou reform is not so easy, Jörg. I would like to now move to the next bucket. I actually get most of the question in the international affairs bucket, so maybe we'll be a bit more brief in the second bucket on policy. I would like to first start with, again, because we talked about the economy, about business. We talked about a lot of the issues, and also a little bit already on the real estate side on what the solution could be. And now I would like to link the topic of the third plenum that you mentioned, which is basically the highest, the most authoritative policy making in structural reforms. And then you would have the Central Economic Work Conference also upcoming for 2024. And my question is now, what do you think, how would you characterize the overall game plan? Of course, in the overall game plan, it is important to look at the real estate sector, but how would you think is basically, what could be the package of things that will come? Or are you pessimistic there will be nothing announced? Or what would come out of a third plenum if it were to take place in a few weeks, still this year?
It will not, I think it will not take place. We don't know if the third plenum, and there has to be one plenum a year. They had a second one this year. If the third plenum next year will be covering the economy, could cover another topic. It's not a mechanism that is a must. But again, the kind of reluctance of actually coming up with a roadmap on the economy is already very telling. So I guess that it's all about getting the Chinese economy into the long landing mode. So no hard landing, soft landing is impossible, too many issues. So long landing, meaning like kicking the can down the road, evergreening loans, for example, putting the pressure basically on the commercial banks, having to restructure them, accepting higher debt levels, central government, for example, which still has deep pockets. And in order to see that actually the system gets stabilized, that what it does not include is the rhetoric, the narrative that people feel better. They don't have the sense that the leadership actually has a firm grip on it, and they can tell it's going to get better. So what we have now is Sunday speeches, warm-hearting, is all going to be fine. At the same time, you know, my kids don't get a job, and the guys don't employ, and the city servants, officials have to get their salaries cut by 20%, even in prestigious cities like Qingdao and other areas. So in a way, there has to be a little bit of a sense of decisiveness and clarity about where China's going. And that used to be the strength, that used to be the DNA over the last 30 years that was always coming down this road. But now they have apparently real trouble to understand that the good old days are gone. Urbanization has reached 60%, so there will be still urbanization, but not to the magnitude they thought. They don't have an increasing population more, they have a decreasing population. Again, that level is an all-time high, partly also courtesy to COVID. And then everybody knows that China's aging. You know, 13% is 65, my age group, this year, and it will be 65 of age, about 30% in 2050. You know, 2050 sounds far away, but it's just 27 years from now, you know. And so how do you finance that? How do you prepare your population, the pension funds? How do you actually get people to understand this? Yes, your real estate value is sinking like a stone, in particular in third and fourth tier cities, 25%. But at the same time, don't you worry, daddy's state is going to look after you and your kids. It's not going to happen anymore. So in a way, we have a lot of uncertainty there. I guess the 20s will be stable. We still might envisage at least 3% growth for the next years to come. But it's going to get dicey in the 30s, because then actually the kind of aging shows in the availability of the workforce. And again, China is not a standalone country. It is certainly in its own league at this stage with the United States in size and in a kind of domestic market they have. But again, there are other markets developing equally strong, and India is one of them. I don't see India as a competitor in the 20s at all, but certainly it's going to be attractive in the 30s. So again, it might sound very far away, but people think along these lines here. And some of them are also basically now voting with their feet, particularly the higher up middle class, that is particularly in the IT sector. The kind of crackdown from 2017 is still bleeding. Jack Ma stands for it. And you can see an exodus in small numbers, but high profile and high calibration content, so to speak, to the Emirates, to Japan, to other countries. And these people were making the difference in the economy over the last 10, 20 years. So in a way, it's a very stressful situation, and we can only wish the leadership finds the right solutions, because we really cannot afford China to fail.
I would like to weave in another question. You actually raised the topic of how China's rhetoric will be towards its consumers to reinstill basically trust and the positive consumer sentiment. What do you think, by just having watched Chinese government and also understanding its polity, how government operates in China, what are actually its toolbox, you know, to do that? Will it be through numbers? Will it be through policies? Will it be through a speech, a State of the Union address? Basically, how can government basically speak to the end consumers directly to reinstill trust?
That's a complicated issue, because at this stage, the more they are stressed out, the more it's top down, and the less actually the top leadership is willing to receive negative data sets. I mean, you know, you have CICC here that has been told, a wonderful analyst group, a bank, a major investment bank, not to be negative anymore. You know, youth unemployment data is vanishing. Some people question GDP data. So how do you communicate changes in the economic landscape if you don't have the information, the data set, or even if you have, so you're not willing to share it in a coherent manner that people accept as reality, you know? So there might be a little bit of feeling of like, oh yeah, these guys are doing a Beijing opera, you know, it's very shrill, very colorful, but what is the essence of that, you know? So is there gonna be something where people feel like pension funds will be established, unemployment will be looked after differently, and so forth? These are very painful decisions to take, you know. Again, for example, the essence of the challenges locally that really erode a lot of confidence is the taxation system. You know, Beijing takes about 50% of local income away from provinces and cities and might return 20% or something like that to maintain control also over what these provinces are doing, and hence force these cities and governments and regions in order to go into land sales in order to make up for the difference. You know, are they now going to say, all right, I don't take away 50% from what you earn, I take away 20%, you know? And is still Beijing then able to have all its, you know, obligations towards the defense or domestic security or Belt and Road and all of the above in a way. So the taxation system to go from a very strong centralized system to a more decentralized system is difficult in any country. You know, I can tell you as a German, it's sort of like, does Baden-Württemberg want to finance Bremen? Certainly not, you know. So in a way, we have something which requires difficult political decision, medium to long term, and the situation requires a short-term fix, and it's not going to happen. So we will sort of limp along for a while until they have found their language in order to project faith and credibility in the marketplace. So let's hope they manage that.
Yeah. Thank you, Jörg. I have to be transparent that I was already assuming that we can spend the full hour. That's why I was spending a bit more time on the economic policy topics. There would be 3 topics more that I would raise. One is basically on the de-risking. A second one would be on the fertility policy, on the demographics. And the last one would be on the visa liberalization. But I'll skip these economic topics for now, just for those who will can only stay with us for 45 minutes. And I jump into the international affairs bucket. There's also most of the questions. And I think the most imminent thing that you will be watching up close is, of course, the EU-China summit that is upcoming. I think it's on the 11th and 12th December. So it's just next week or the next week. You will know better. So
7th and 8th of December, actually next week. You're right.
Next week, yeah. So basically, could you? We have had multiple EU summits. The last 2 did not produce any joint statements. What is the specific context of this upcoming EU-China summit? What can we expect? What are the main topics that will be discussed?
Expect nothing. To be honest, expectation management. I think China will possibly not be in a position to offer anything. And Europe cannot offer much because we are a very open society. The only thing possibly Europe can offer is to close up more, meaning protectionist, meaning the subsidy case. So the only thing that Europe can offer is stay open, and China is not willing to open up more. So I'm afraid worst case, Borrell might be right. It might be another dialogue of the death. Are there topics of common interest? I'm sure climate change will always be one of them where we can find common ground. But on the economy, I don't see China moving, because if you look at the US-China summit, they had a resolution on opiates, fentanyl. They had a better communication channels, military to military, and they increased flights. Now, we don't have a Chinese opiate problem in Europe, where we certainly don't have a mil-mil problem. And on top of it, we have enough flights between Europe and China. So these 3 areas where the US could find something, there's nothing for us to gain. And on the economic side, the US got 0, absolutely nothing. So the Chinese didn't get anything because the US didn't promise to stop the sanctions. Now, what we might say is that possibly Michel and von der Leyen can explain more how China has to deal with overcapacity, because that is a genuine threat to our landscape, to our employment, to our supply chains, and so forth. And on top of it, oversupply in China means that certainly in third markets, it might be a dumping ground. And how can European business basically compete against Chinese companies in a desperation mode, meaning just dumping anything abroad, competing against us, and many of them again in a subsidized mode. So they have to explain how the subsidy case is working out, and I hope our leaders find the language. And I just met Ursula von der Leyen for dinner in Brussels last Monday. I hope they find the language to actually entice the Chinese to come into Europe and create jobs there. We want Chinese companies more in Europe in order to be in the same economic zone like us, to be more like us, frankly speaking. And I think it would diffuse a lot of these protectionist forces in Europe if China would, frankly, just create more jobs in Europe by investing and, frankly, by buying more. You know, we had just sales of European 27 exports to China 23% more than to your own country, Marcus, Switzerland. And so, you know, China obviously is in a very lopsided position, and that is politically not feasible. And again, we have a country, a region with Europe that has been trying to stay in the middle ground and not become America with sanctions and so forth. But the kind of inability to move and accommodate European concerns might actually force our leaders to become far more assertive and robust than we thought 1 or 2 years ago. So it's going to be definitely not a sunshine summit. I hope it's going to be a good explanation summit where basically both parties leave. They might understand each other better. I hope that might then eventually leave space for better resolutions. But at this stage, I don't see anything positive coming out of this summit.
When you say that the discussion with von der Leyen, that it is also about attracting Chinese companies to create jobs in Europe and basically compete also on European business conditions with European players. To what extent do you think the Chinese side will now perceive its own list of economic concerns growing? Because now Chinese and also Chinese entrepreneurs, they are aware they're entering actually a de-risking context, and actually semantically, because Europe has actually created that notion. To what extent is that going to actually change the dynamics in the discussion of what Europe has been asking for as a level playing field and market access? And now basically China can probably even more explicitly refer to the de-risking policy factor for its own business if they want to enter European market.
I would say that Chinese entrepreneurs are possibly misled by state propaganda here. De-risking is labeled as decoupling with European characteristics. And that is a very bad analogy, really, because in a way, de-risking was supposed to be a clear statement of having not used decoupling and putting up the knife on the EU-China economic relationship. It was saying, like, look at the risks, and there are some, of course, in the dependency area and like API, vitamins, and so forth. But at the same time, it was clearly a willingness to cooperate, you know. So to actually not acknowledge that is sort of pushing it aside and sort of denying the Europeans their own economic willpower. There's always the perception in China is like, you know, we dance to the fiddle of the White House and Biden, which is very ill-conceived and actually is degrading for our policymakers back home. So I hope that actually they look at us as we voice our concerns as our concern and not sort of remote controlled from Joe Biden. That I think is really important to understand that de-risking means continuous engagement, but finding areas where we actually have to defend ourselves. Just recently, gallium, germanium, graphite, and so on and so on. Because after all, China has been preaching and teaching us de-risking for a long, long period of time, in particular in areas where it hurts us economically. For example, in the telephone area, 5G, you know, we have two champions. And their market share eroded from 3 to 2%, whereas Huawei still is 59% of the 5G market in Germany. So in a way, China very often has been using its political firepower in order to have two markets for their companies, Chinese and the global market, whereas we were struggling to have part of the Chinese market, particularly in the service sector. So I don't know if they will be understanding that. Again, a stressed out Chinese leadership that is trying to safeguard its job size, economics, might actually not be willing to accommodate and compromise.
Thank you, Jörg. I would like to weave in a question that from a webinar participant that is picking up on your point that that you have been apparently discussing with senior EU levels on the fact that you want to attract more Chinese companies into Europe. The question is, we already have a serious shortage of employees with skilled employees in Europe. Why do you want more Chinese companies creating jobs in Europe?
Well, they could come with Chinese employees, you know. I mean, just one very big German car company has transferred 500 top-end engineers to their own country in order to facilitate this. Secondly, you know, I know one company quite well where an engineering shortage in Germany was relieved by employing people in Chengdu and Sichuan and beefing up a high-end engineering center from 7 to 400. So in a way, there can be synergies if we trust each other and if we think that, you know, China can offer something. I think that is an underutilized cooperation thing to have Chinese brains helping us in the shortage of qualified people, in particular in engineering, I would say. So in a way, you know, what China has done with Tesla to get Tesla into the country as a competitor, but also as someone who is very skillfully building up supply chains, we could do the same with BYD and other companies, you know. And I'm pretty sure that the German car industry, at least, they're quite willing to accept that, because they also would benefit from a sub-supplier landscape that has been certainly improved by Chinese companies, because frankly, they are just ahead of us. You know, we are honestly followers. And so why should we take advantage of someone who is actually more advanced in something and not try to do this? And secondly, I guess we also have to analyze where China has a dedicated, a distinct weakness developing, I would say, on artificial intelligence. On the talent pool side, we see talents moving to the US and other places. And then on the technology side, with not having access to the semiconductors from TSMC, for example, that require an AI. So Europe is miles behind on KI. And so I urge European leaders always, you know, spend the money where we are not good at, but could be good at, and don't sort of try to replicate Chinese overcapacity in trying to be secure in green technologies, where basically the Chinese are throwing the stuff nearly free of charge on the marketplace.
I have another question, adding a very interesting factor to the discussion of the upcoming EU-China summit, which is actually the EU level elections in 2024. And I think the question I would like to put to you is maybe on short, basically in short notice, or in the context of the summit, is that a factor? Yeah. But maybe in the bigger picture, how will it affect the EU's policymaking towards China in the midterm?
I think for Beijing, it is very important to realize that Europe looks at the elections through the glasses of past elections we had, particularly on Russian trolls, Russian money flying, going into some of the parties. You know, as you've seen, the tendency of more populism in Europe, just Gerd Wilders, then you had Le Pen, then you have AfD in Germany. You know, these parties, there is a whiff of Chinese money in there. And of course, everybody has seen what happened in Australia and Canada, and everybody has seen what happened to the US when it comes to Russia. I think it is very important for China to go the extra mile to actually make sure that its whatever outlets, official, semi-official, is staying away with a mile from the elections in any measure. If there's a whiff of China intervention and we have difficult party landscape afterwards, you know, I mean, the bet is off of how bad Europe-China relationship is going to be. So it's in their hands. They can do it, you know. But it is very important because again, there are apparently some indications. So I worry about the elections, that they actually might go and turn into a more anti-China behavior after the elections, frankly speaking.
On climate, which you mentioned as one of the areas where cooperation could continue, can you link that to the industrial level? Because on the industrial level of green tech, basically where both sides are competing, and of course China has in many of the relevant technologies that you already mentioned has a lead over Europe, yeah, and maybe even globally. How do you see that, yeah, dynamic playing out in wanting to cooperate on climate, but at the same time actually in implementing it are to be strong competitors?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you know, China is a world champion in virtually all of these green technologies. You know, when you look into solar panels, China has the capacity of building solar panels globally 2.5 times. You know, 40 gigawatt were installed in Europe last year. We have 80 gigawatt of solar panels, not just Chinese, also others in the storages in Europe. So in a way, we benefit in a way from cheap Chinese solar panels. Prices went down, I guess, even to 70% some cases, in order to actually help us on the green transition. Now, on wind turbines, of course, wind turbines in China get bigger and better, and we could benefit from this one. The question is, of course, how much do we need our own Gamesa, Siemens, or Vestas and Nordex in order to sustain? Of course, it would be great to have those areas. But at the same time, we need a green transition, and we cannot outcompete Chinese subsidies. There is just no way in hell. And so on the EV side, of course, we have to see how we hang in there, how we can benefit both without rolling over us again the 50 million cars that China can produce. But where we really benefit, and China benefits, is how we do environmental protection. We have companies signing up long-term agreements in energy-intensive industries, showcasing how a 25-year long-term take-or-pay agreement actually turns a high energy-intensive and high-polluting industry into a green technology. We have companies investing in wind parks and other areas in order to showcase that actually they managed to produce clean in the People's Republic of China. So in a way, we still have it. I mean, if you just look at Maersk, for example, the development they did on the green hydrogen in order to actually then power their ships is primarily made in China based on green technology, I think from Ningxia. So in a way, I think what we can offer is demand for that kind of energy, but also mechanisms, because we have used them for many, many years. And I know personally that China is very willing to embrace that, because then they want to replicate this and basically introduce it to other companies, Chinese companies. And that is definitely extremely beneficial if that happens faster, because energy intensive industries, again, China's scope footprint is huge. If we can help them to fix that faster, it can only help climate change globally. So in a way, we have something to offer, and China has something to offer. And I think the kind of black and white, yin and yang, and you are against us and so forth, and climate change, climate change is not going to wait for us to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for re-advocating that climate change is a global issue, right? Where cooperation is ultimately really essential. I have two more international affairs questions I want to touch on. The one is briefly on US-China, and the last one will be on the Taiwan elections that we'll have on the 13th January next year. US-China relations, you already mentioned the outcome of the Xi-Biden summit at the sidelines of OPEC was mill-mill cooperation, people-to-people and commercial flights. So if these things have been clarified, what are we now moving in as a stage? Is it now the actual competition or the actual execution of all the announcements, like for instance, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, etc.? What are we moving in that stage of the relationship?
I noticed when I was in the White House in May that Biden's team is definitely aiming at de-escalation, which is great. And I think they found more open ears in Beijing, because also Beijing is hurting from the sanctions that China has been receiving from the US. And again, if you have an economic crisis, maybe to have the biggest trading partner or the biggest technology partner going after you is maybe not a good idea. You can only have that many problems on your plate at the same time. So I guess that the summit was sort of they're putting a floor under their relationship, meaning they don't want it to escalate further. There was an acknowledgement, I guess, on Taiwan. I hope that holds, and that we have a relationship which certainly will not improve much. I think trust is virtually zero, and the US has made it very clear, in particular Gina Raimondo, to say, we guys want to withhold top technologies from you for dual use, military use, technology gains. The US has basically turned the game, is trying to turn the game from confrontation to competition. They call it competition. I guess many people in Beijing still feel it's confrontation, but at least they put a floor under this relationship. So I would say, unless Trump gets elected and all bets are off, we have at least more predictability in the relationship, even though the outlook is certainly not going to be rosy, but at least something where we can deal with, manage, talk to each other. But love lost will not be recuperated.
So the paradigm now is competition, as you were saying. If we go to Taiwan elections, that's about 6 weeks away. Can you explain briefly what is at stake and what do you think could be the outcomes?
Well, at stake is that DPP, I guess, will win. We will have a situation where the DPP leaders have to be very politically aware of any noises they make. I think they have to be coached by the Americans, maybe also by the Europeans, of making clear that the red line of one China policy is not going to be touched. We had a good life with status quo like that for 45, more than 40, 50 years. So we have to see what the language of the new president is going to be. Beijing has been toning down criticism on this whole process, knowing that it would fuel the flames in Taipei. We have also to realize that from Beijing's point of view, is a blockade or war is at this stage not possible militarily, which is a good thing. They look at Ukraine, Russia. But of course, everything is then depending on how are decision makers in Europe having a strong opinion, to have strong relationship economically with Taiwan, but actually holding their hand and say, we don't want you to become independent. And then the US basically, you know, what's Trump going to do? That's a big unknown factor. So I would say I am, like my friend Kevin Rudd, more relaxed when it comes to Taiwan. I think Beijing has clearly understood that the West will respond with sanctions, and they have looked at foreign currency exchange reserves, the aviation monopoly that foreign companies nearly have in the skies of China. And I guess there are enough reasonable people here. But again, you know, if you have a US general saying by 2025 there will be a war, we just have to be cool about it and just assume that this is just rhetoric. So in a way, it's as my friend Bonnie Glaser always puts it, deterrence and assurance. Maybe make the cost-benefit analysis on an attack on Taiwan very, very dicey for Beijing. You can achieve that in many manners. And assurances is clearly like, you Taiwan or we West will not recognize it, we will not cross the red line, and Beijing will stop lobbing rockets over the island of Taiwan.
Jörg, thank you so much for doing such a for covering so much ground in, I think, 50 plus minutes. And I think the unique thing you add is that it comes across that you talk to all these different actors, that you say, you know how a mayor thinks in China to actually understand Chinese policymaking. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. I would like to conclude with a private question, because you are in your 4th decade, based as a home and as a country that you like so much in China, but you're making adjustments into next year. I would like to ask you, what are those adjustments and how do you feel about them?
Well, I came first time with a couple of friends by train in 1982, which is, as you might remember, last century. I feel stone old, and I've been living here 33 years. It's my second home, and it is now time to move on. I get retired from my daytime job in July next year, and I decided to continue working. I have 3 kids, 12, 13, 15. And they're in an American school, and I want them to have a smooth transition. An American school indicates that US, of course, preferred location. And I feel great about it. You know, after 40 years of 2 multinational companies, 34 years in mainland China, to start at an advisory in the United States of America is sort of like a rejuvenation program for me, you know. And the good news is I will leave China, but China will not leave me. I will be advising on China, and that is the greatest privilege that I had over the last years, being in this incredibly civilization with all these friends. So in a way, the question I had in my recent speech is, shall I stay or shall I go? Actually, yes, I'm leaving, but at the same time, I will return, but more on a visiting kind of schedule.
Jörg, thank you very much for sharing your precious time with us today. It's really a privilege also to have you in the International Board of STARS. We look forward to have your continued engagement there. I would like to thank all the participants who were part of this webinar. Please stay tuned for 2024, what we will prepare for you in terms of China analysis and discussions. Thank you very much for your time. And thank you, Jörg, again. Warm regards to Beijing.
再见。
再见. Bye-bye, Jörg. Thank you.